Hi everyone, thank you for coming today for Commemorating Vincent Chin. I'm Michael Chong, and I'm the Executive Director of the Chinese American Museum, and we're located in Los Angeles, California. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge and thank our moderators and panelists for accepting our invitation today. I also want to thank so many of our board members and advisory council members who are here with us today. And a special acknowledgement to our community partners of the Chinese American Citizens Alliance, LA Large, OCA-GLA, and Visual Communications. Also want to take this time I also want to take this time to provide some information for the program. This event is being recorded and will be broadcast on YouTube at a later date. We are asking all attendees to keep your microphone and video off. So if you do have your microphones on or your video on, please turn it off. For the best experience, we ask if you can utilize speaker view. And if you're experiencing any technical difficulties, we do ask you to use the chat box and privately message Chinese American Museum as the host or CAM as the other host. Rochelle, a staff member, will be on standby to assist you. If time permits, we'll be taking several questions from the audience. We do ask if you can use the raise hand feature during the Q&A portion. Rochelle will message you with details on how to, once you raise your hands and how to ask your questions. Thank you. Tonight's event commemorates the legacy of Vincent Chin, whose life was lost in a racially driven violent beating. We'll be discussing the history of this hate crime, the activism that resulted from it, as well as the injustices that continue to face the people of color today. I would like to now introduce the moderator for the program, Paula Madison. Paula is an award-winning journalist and former media executive of NBC. She authored Finding Samuel Lowe, sharing the journey of finding her long-lost grandfather. Madison is also a chairman and CEO of Madison Media Management and also serves as the Friends of the Chinese American Museum first vice president. Thank you, Paula, for joining us. Paula, I'm sorry, you are on mute right now.
Thank you. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Great. I would like to first thank you all for joining us for this commemorative event. The first panelist I'm going to introduce is Renee Tajima-Peña, who's an Academy Award nominated documentary filmmaker whose credits are Who Killed Vincent Chin, My America, or Honk If You Love Buddha, No Mas Babies, and other films about themes of immigrants, race, ethnicity, gender, and social justice. Tajima-Peña is the producer showrunner of Asian Americans, the 5-hour miniseries, which I'm sure most of us just watched, about the Asian American experience that aired last month on PBS. Tajima-Peña is also a professor of Asian American Studies at UCLA. Welcome, Renee.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Oh, I'm sorry. Everybody, sorry, okay.
Okay, I'm gonna introduce next my friend, Stewart Quo. And Stuart Quo is an attorney, educator, and civil rights leader known to so many of us here in LA. He's the founder and past president and executive director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice Los Angeles, currently known as Advancing Justice LA. Stewart is a nationally recognized leader and expert in race relations, American studies, nonprofit organizations and philanthropies, civil rights, and legal services. He was the first Asian American attorney and human rights activist to receive the MacArthur Foundation Fellowship, often referred to as the Genius Grant, in 1998. Welcome, Stuart.
Thank you.
And then finally, my millennial friend, Pamela Ng. And Pamela is a national organizer at SAG-AFTRA, mostly working with voice actors across the nation to unionize. She's an LA native, growing up in the San Gabriel Valley and currently residing in East LA. Somebody should kill their mic, sorry. In addition to organizing, Pamela cares deeply about grassroots, community spaces, ethnic studies, and her dog. Welcome, Pamela. So next, Renee, we're going to turn to you to have you share with our pretty large audience your thoughts about this commemoration.
Okay, now it's my turn. Sorry about that. Yeah, wow. Thank you very much. Thank you, Paula, for the introduction. And thank you, Cam, for inviting me to talk about the Vincent Chin case. It's been, I guess, 37 years since I first got a mimeographed news clipping in the mail. In those days, it was snail mail. There's no internet, from Jack Chen, who is the founder actually of what's now the Museum of Chinese Americans in New York. And in this news clipping, it described this murder, this horrendous murder of a Chinese American draftsman named Vincent Chin on the night of his bachelor party in Detroit. This was in the middle of the auto recession in Detroit at a time that Japanese car imports were being blamed for the recession and for all the unemployment, and by extension, Japanese people. And because, you know, people can't tell us apart, any Asian American was a target in Detroit. And within this kind of environment of hostility, Vincent, you know, went out with his buddies for his bachelor party. By the end of the night, he was dead. He was beaten to death with a baseball bat by two Chrysler workers, Ron Ebens and Michael Nitz. And Jack and other people were sending around the news clippings and information about the case because by 1983, they pleaded guilty to manslaughter. Judge Charles Kaufman gave them probation and a fine. As somebody described it, it was a $3,000 fine, 3-year probation. People said it's like paying off your car payments. You got 3 years to pay off your car payments. And so Asian Americans in Detroit were outraged, and Asian Americans, of course, across the country, as we began to find out about the case, we were outraged. That's you know, upon hearing it, I decided with Chris Choi, who I was working with at Third World Newsreel, a film collective, to make a film about the case, which became Who Killed Vincent Chin. I want to give some context to the case itself and to the activism. In Asian Americans, the series that I just series produced, Viet Thanh Nguyen, who is a Vietnamese novelist, said something very interesting about the Vincent Chin case, that when it happened, Asian Americans weren't shocked because it represented something new. They were shocked because it was an old story. It represented something old. And for that reason, that continuity of xenophobia and systemic racism that was at the roots of the Vincent Chin case, for that reason, it resonates with our current moment, this pandemic of hate. The pandemic of hate, not only directed to us as Asian Americans with the, you know, everybody from the president on down, describing it as the so-called Kung flu, as he just described it again on Saturday in Tulsa, but also the pandemic of hate directed towards Black, Brown, and Indigenous people in this continuing drumbeat of racial violence and police violence. So first, in terms of the old story, that the legacy that the Vincent Chin case really symbolizes, one is anti-Asian violence. And, you know, as I said, there are long roots of systemic racism and xenophobia that have been true ever since we began arriving in the United States. You know, when the first major wave of Asian immigrants were arriving in the late 1800s, the early 1900s, there was a time of anti-Asian exclusion, parallel to that, a time of Jim Crow racism. It was a time when racial science was placing whites at the top of the hierarchy, Blacks at the bottom, Asian Americans occupying a place in between. And so those fault lines of that systemic racism and xenophobia has been true throughout our history in this country. And those fault lines erupt during times of crises. For my family, it erupted in World War II. During the war, the Pacific War, I'm Japanese American. You know, my family was incarcerated in concentration camps in the West. They were evacuated from here, from their home in Los Angeles. It happened in the 1980s during the auto recession that led to the killing of Vincent Chin It happened to South Asians and Muslim Asian Americans after 9/11 with the racial profiling and the violence and even murder that they experienced. And of course, it's happening today. But the other part of that old story, the legacy for Asian Americans, is a long tradition of activism and solidarity. And it goes back to, you know, our labor history. In the 1860s, the single largest labor strike in all of the United States was mounted by Chinese immigrant railroad workers. You look through the 20th century, the Filipino and Mexican farm workers in Delano uniting to launch the International Grape Strike. The long history of Asian-Black solidarity, the profound impact of the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s. In the 1970s, Bayard Rustin, the civil rights leader, and other African-American leaders calling on the US to welcome Southeast Asian refugees as being the right thing to do. In the 1960s and 70s, Asian Americans joining with other students of color and progressive white students to demand ethnic studies, to defend and demand affirmative action. And into the 1980s, when Vincent Chin was killed and people began to know about his case and the injustice of his case, and the campaign for justice was launched all across the country, the Asian American movement and many of the student activists like Stewart, like Helen Zia, people all over the country who came out of that legacy, that tradition of activism and solidarity, many of them were at the forefront of the campaign for justice, along with local Detroit activists. And the Vincent Chin case, I think, was really seminal because it expanded this pan-ethnic Asian American movement, which already existed, had always existed, and had been building for years and years, but it expanded it to many more communities. So I'm going to show you a short clip. It's actually two excerpts from the Asian American series that for PBS, and we tell the story of the Vincent Chin case, but we kind of start by contextualizing it through the anti-Asian violence that was being experienced by other communities at that time. So you'll meet Mi Moa, who's a Hmong American. And again, it's two excerpts, so you'll see a little bit of black in between the excerpts, but if you can go to the videotape.
In the late 1970s, refugees are escaping war-torn Southeast Asia and coming to the United States. They settle in the big cities, but they also move to small towns across the country.
Growing up, I always identified as being Hmong, not even Hmong American. My family came to the United States in 1978. We were refugees in the aftermath of the Vietnam War. I grew up in the Midwest. And I remember walking my brothers and sisters to school, and we would have cars go by. People would throw their ashtrays out the window at us. You know, give us the finger. They would say, you know, chink, gook, go back to your own country. I didn't grow up with a consciousness that actually there were other Asian Americans experiencing similar things. It felt very isolating, and it felt like we just had to suck it up.
Mimoa's perspective would be drastically transformed by an event that will rock the Asian American community. It happens in Detroit on a summer night in 1982.
Was Vincent Chin beaten to death with a baseball bat because he was Oriental? The brutal slaying has outraged the Chinese community in Detroit and across the nation.
What began out of that was meetings that started with 4 people, 10 people, 20 people, 100 people, and people were talking about what can we do, what can we do, what can we do. I raised my hand and I said, the world wants to know how the Asian American community feels about this.
In depth, Vincent Chin inspired protest marches, rallies, dinners, banquets.
Justice for Vincent Chin!
The killing of Vincent Chin is probably the most tragic example of the kind of violence that's being committed against Asians.
For Asian Americans, Vincent Chin's murder symbolized an extreme example of the kind of discrimination that they'd face. It becomes a rallying point for Asian Americans to be able to say, that's me too.
I was a freshman in college when I heard about Vincent Chin and the impact on the Asian American community. And it was the first time that I felt like my experience as a Hmong refugee, as a Southeast Asian, was connected to the experience of other Asian Americans. I am finally a piece of the puzzle that completes the picture. And it was so liberating.
Okay, and next, one of the young activist lawyers who was there throughout the campaign for justice, Stewart Quo. You're muted. There we go.
Thank you, Renee. And thank you to the Chinese Museum for sponsoring this. And in particular, thank you to Gay and Michael. And I've been friends with Paula for a number of years, so it's great to have her as moderator. I just wanted to mention how I got involved in the Vincent Chin case and then bring it up to date to talk about what are some of the lessons and some of the things that we can learn from that as applied to today. I read about the Vincent Chin case in the LA Times in 1983. And in 1983, that's when we first began Asian Americans Advancing Justice. Then we were called the Asian Pacific American Legal Center. And I asked my board if I should go to Detroit and see if I could help. And they said, yes, you should go. I called a few of the people whose names were in the newspaper, like Helen, one of the attorneys, Lisa Chan. And so I did fly to Detroit. And it was a horrible situation with the mother losing her only child who was celebrating his upcoming marriage. What I helped them to do was to organize around trying to petition the federal government for a federal hate crimes charge, because I didn't think that the appeal of the state sentence would end up in anything good. And I was right, but unfortunately, we did get the federal hate crime, but because of the appeal to the hate crime conviction in the first federal trial, then the case was moved to Cincinnati, and the almost all-white jury decided it was more of a barroom brawl and acquitted both killers who never spent a day of their lives in jail for killing Vincent. I was asked by Paula and the organizers to try to say, what did the Vincent Chin case mean and how does it apply today? Let me talk about 3 things. One is, I think the Vincent Chin case, the story was horrible. The facts were horrible. The sentence was horrible. The outcome was horrible. I remember visiting Lily Chin, the mother, in China in 1995. and she was smiling during, and I brought my whole family. She was smiling, but in her eyes, I could tell she had lost everything. After the federal trial, the second federal trial, she decided she couldn't live in the United States anymore, and she moved back to China until she got deathly ill in 2001 and came back to the United States and passed away in 2002. But I think the Vincent Chin case, while in itself very sad, inspiring because of the mother's tenacious fight for justice, was an awakening for the Asian American and particularly the Chinese community, that we were celebrating the 1965 immigration law, where Asians could unite with their family members, and there was a big wave of Asian immigration. So there was a tremendous hope for the future. There was tremendous optimism for the future. But when Vincent Chin was killed, and the horrible consequence in the courts, I think it was a wake-up call. It awakened us to realize that we were not going to be the model minority. We were going to be the perpetual foreigner, that we were going to be attacked because Japanese, in this case, were taking over part of the car industry in the United States. So it was an awakening that we were still going to be subject to the cycles between being the model minority and being the perpetual foreigner, and that we would be subject to attacks every so many years. In 1943, Japanese Americans were attacked. In 1982, Vincent Chin was killed. In 2001, South Asians and Muslim Americans, a number were slaughtered and shot to death on the streets of the United States. In Los Angeles, Joseph Aledo was killed in 1999 by white supremacists. So we've seen these cycles, and now we're in another cycle where we've counted at least 2,300 hate incidents against Asian Americans throughout the United States in just the last 3 months, because we're being blamed for the coronavirus. The president is whipping up racism against us, even as of 2 days ago, 3 days ago, calling it the Kung flu, calling it the Chinese virus. So we're seeing those cycles once again. So bringing Vincent Chin's case up to date, we're really experiencing one of those cycles again. The second thing I just want to add is that we need to really teach Americans about our true history, about how we've been challenged, how we've overcome some of the challenges, how we've contributed to the country. And so the ethnic studies becomes very important for all of us to fight for. Even in California, ethnic studies is not required. There's only one story that's been approved, and that's on Fred Korematsu, because his daughter, Karen, a good friend of mine, has fought for it for many years. We need ethnic studies. In fact, my wife, Pat, has taken the lead for the curriculum based on the PBS story and is writing 36 lesson plans as I speak. So they will be finished by the end of the summer. So we need to fight for ethnic studies and get this curriculum in the schools, because other Americans don't know our history, don't know what we've gone through. So the second lesson for today is we should use the opportunity to get our curriculum in all the schools so that across the country, 1 million or more students will learn about us. The third thing I wanted to say is that we have an opportunity right now to build coalitions. We have an opportunity because Blacks, Latinos, Pacific Islanders, American Indians are being disproportionately impacted by the coronavirus. We have witnessed the protest against the murder of George Floyd. People are on the move. There is a movement at foot to create a truly equal America. We have an opportunity to build coalitions perhaps as never before. We have had the opportunities, but we didn't necessarily fulfill the full opportunity. As Renee said, there have been a number of instances where there was unity, but we didn't build the big coalitions across the board that would push progress in the United States. I would just like to add, though, that the possibility of coalitions has been there since we arrived. For the first 100 years of Asian American existence in the United States, we were treated as Blacks. In 1854, in the People versus Hall case, we were not considered white. We were considered Black or mulatto, so we couldn't testify against whites in a criminal trial. In 1922 and 1923, in the Thind and Ozawa cases, we were told by the US Supreme Court we could not become US citizens because we were not white. We were Black or we were mulatto. There are many instances where we have been treated as African Americans or Black, but we have not united with Blacks on a large scale. However, Blacks have reached out to us. In 1869, Frederick Douglass made a very powerful statement. He was asked, for the Chinese, what would you expect them to be? He said, I would favor such immigration. Would you have them naturalized and have them invested with all the rights of American citizens? He said, I would. Would you allow them to vote? He said, I would. He said, I want the Asian people to find a home here in the United States and feel at home here, both for their sake and for ours. Frederick Douglass in 1869 reached out to the Chinese community to say, we should coalesce. We need an America that is a diverse country. And in the 1940s, the one group that really stood up against Japanese American incarceration very loudly was the NAACP, that wrote many articles opposing the incarceration of Japanese Americans. So I would just say, we have an opportunity now for us to start uniting. I just reached out to the SEIU. They're willing to put into their platform the opposition to anti-Asian violence. We have worked with the international president, but we have to reach out to the Black community right now to form the coalition that will help to stop the anti-Asian violence, but also to bring about an end to police brutality. So I think we have these opportunities in the present day to really make a change in America, to make a change for the good of the people in the United States. So I look forward to your questions, and I'd like to turn over the program to Pamela Ng, who will talk about this current day for the millennial generation.
Hi, thank you, Stuart. Yeah, so first I just want to acknowledge that, we are all on occupied native land, and if someone can make sure they're muted. But yeah, I just want to acknowledge that we are all on occupied native land, and specifically for me, Tongva land. All right, so I'm really excited to be speaking on this panel and to see the energy behind wanting to learn more about Vincent Chin. And the significance his murder has on folks across generations. I first learned about Vincent Chin when I was in college as a first-year student in an Asian American Studies course. So, shout out to all the folks still fighting for ethnic studies everywhere. Like many who learn about his murder and the oh-so-surprising subsequent lack of justice, I was, of course, appalled and angry. But I think even more than that, I felt something that I think a lot of folks who learn about violent history that happened to people who look like them for the very first times, I felt confusion. And I asked, that pivotal question that I think a lot of folks ask when they're learning these histories of why didn't I know about this before? And, this is a question I've seen and am seeing asked, whether explicitly or not, by many young progressive Asians as they're navigating, becoming activated and politicized. And it's a question that I think hangs in the air right now, especially as young Asians are navigating, many for the first time, this really historic moment where there's a huge rise in anti-Asian racism, as well as what it means to move in solidarity with Black organizers leading uprisings across the nation to dismantle the police. And underscoring all of that, a witnessing of a complete upend in how capitalism normally operates. So I think this question and what the murder of Vincent Chin means to young folks really speaks to a systemic issue that causes this question to, speaking of cycles, need to be asked in the first place over and over again, every single generation. And I would argue that it is actually a significant challenge in organizing in our communities, but also in multiracial or multi-ethnic coalitions. When there is so little institutional memory of resistance, especially in the coalitions that we've built over time, it ultimately benefits the institutions that divide us. And an example that pops into my head is one of the protest signs that I've seen on the streets a lot, being both used and also critiqued. And that's the Yellow Peril Supports Black Power sign. It's a reference to the 60s and 70s of Asians in solidarity with the Black Panther Party. And I won't go into all of the critiques of this sign, but I definitely encourage you all to look into those. Because they're definitely valid. But I think from an organizing perspective, it really shows a hunger for our histories and really highlights this really huge gap in knowledge of, all of the meaningful work that our communities have engaged in between back then and now. So, when we don't know about these atrocities and the subsequent resistance that really stems from them, we continuously believe that we as the young generation are the very first people ever to be progressive, to dismantle, and to work in coalition spaces. And I've been there. It's really freaking exhausting, but most importantly, it's just not true. And, I think my fellow panelists are prime examples, and there are elders in our community who are doing this work, that have been doing this work since the 60s and 70s. And we can learn from them and work with them. So, and, in addition to all that, some of your peers are doing this work too. So the more you know your histories of resistance, I think the more you can understand how these systems that we're all trying to individually work against in our communities are actually one and the same. And thus, we create more meaningful spaces for actual real solidarity work that doesn't stem only from singular identities and a mentality of what's in it for me. The other thing I really want to highlight is how Vincent Chin was killed because he was perceived as a threat to an existing labor force and economy, specifically the auto industry, as Renee mentioned earlier. It's actually very pertinent to this current moment, as other folks have mentioned, where Asian Americans are facing an alarming number of racist violence and harassment because of COVID-19 and the impacts this pandemic has had on our economy. So knowing and understanding the significance of Vincent Chin has been integral, at least for me, for really understanding how the model minority myth is inherently tied to labor that Asian Americans provide in this country, and how the narrative that it perpetuates, which coincides with the American dream, is really just a fallacy and a positionality given by white supremacy that can be taken away at any moment. So, when we are engaging in grassroots movements, calling for the defunding of the police, fighting to dismantle the model minority myth, talking about anti-Blackness in all of the different spheres we're in, we can't split the conversation and analysis away from how white supremacy precariously positions people of color communities based on their productivity and labor within capitalism as defined by whiteness. And I think at the core of our efforts to dismantle the model minority myth, we have to remember that it is a specifically anti-Black tool that's been that way throughout history, even before it was coined in the 60s, to justify the violence on Black bodies and Black labor and Black wealth. So to dismantle the model minority myth is really to fight against anti-Blackness, and I don't think that's negotiable. And I really view the current uprisings and what's happening across the nation, led by Black organizers and the Black Lives Matter movement, as, you know, inherently a struggle that is for freedom and justice for all of us. So all is to say, for young folks learning about Vincent Chin and figuring out how we honor his legacy, it's absolutely imperative that, you know, we are showing up for Black folks right now, that we're getting to know the folks in our communities who have been doing this work for years, that we're engaging with and volunteering with grassroots organizations, and also looking within, I would argue, our workspaces too. You know, it's following up that initial question of why didn't I know about this before with who else knows about this? What does this mean for me now? Rather than letting it remain a thing of the past that we look back to. And I will say, as a union organizer, I really encourage folks to learn more about unions and worker centers, organize their workspaces, and look to the many young folks in multiple industries across the nation right now, including within the Asian American movement, who have or are unionizing their workplaces right now. You know, when we're not in a pandemic, our workplace is where we interact with people the most, and workplace structures too often replicate the same dynamics that outside of the workplace systematically harm people of color. And, you know, even in the nonprofit realm, we've seen some real struggles with historic organizations like the Korean Resource Center, like Advancing Justice, having mostly young staff be met with backlash or retaliation for organizing their unions. And, you know, I know it's an uncomfortable and complicated conversation, but I really think it's important to underscore during this moment. And, you know, a more straightforward example is just looking at how corporations like Walmart, which is owned by some of the richest people in the world, where there are predominantly working class people of color working, you know, they've had the most expensive and robust anti-union campaigns and structures to date. So, you know, these types of correlations are not coincidences, and I'll just plug myself that if you're interested in forming a union, you can let me know. But yeah, so I think that's everything I wanted to say. I'm sure I missed some things, but I look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. So I've just got a couple of questions before we are able to, I think, have enough time to take a couple of questions from the many participants we have. I would like for you all to consider for a moment, when I watched, Renee, when I watched your video, what struck me was that the murder of Vincent Chin brought out significant numbers of members of the Asian and Asian American community. But when I saw the videos of meetings and marches, I saw a significant number, I think, of who I would call adults, middle-aged, even elders in the meetings marching. When I look today at the George Floyd and Black Lives Matter protests, it seems to me that there are many, many more people who are of a younger age. Now, Stuart, I'm gonna acknowledge that in the 60s and 70s, you and I were young. and so to the extent that we had some involvement in whatever those movements you know, were going on at the time. But what I'm getting at here is a twofold question. One, is this kind of a revolutionary movement really a young people's movement? One. And two, I guess particularly for Pamela, being a millennial, when you have to explain to your parents' generation and your grandparents' generation, the elders, how do you handle the conversations? Are you accomplishing what they feel you were destined to do to fulfill their goals for when they came to the United States? So I'll back up and let you guys hash that one for a bit.
I mean, since you started with the videos, actually in Detroit, there were a lot of, I guess, adults or, you know, people 30s, 40s, 50s and older in that when it began. But I think the national movement was a cross section of different ages. But I would say over, our history here, young people have really been the engine of the movements. And if you even go back to like the late 1800s, early 1900s, people were young, people who were starting these, the Korean Civic Association, Dosan Chang Ho, and the labor organizers, the Chinese immigrant workers who are organizing, the South Asians in the Gadar Party organizing against, British rule from here in the United States. They were all very young. So I think that, that's just a continuity of the movement.
Stuart?
Well, I agree with you. I think the young persons have really taken the lead on the fight against police brutality and to get justice for George Floyd. I think that pandemic has intersected with this so that older folks like myself are told to stay at home. And I think that's also a factor, because I know my wife and I have really wanted to go to some of the protests, but we were told to basically stay at home. So I think that there's a combination, but I do think that young people are leading the movement and leading the change. I just think that we need to be able to help give them that information from the past, because it's so important. So who would know about these past coalitions? Who would know about those efforts to bridge the communities? And so I think we need to bring those lessons into the movement of today as well, so that the protests can eventually turn into policy change and broad coalitions. Otherwise, they'll slowly die out. But I do think they've been tremendously effective at effectuating the change, because the powers that be are very entrenched, especially with the police unions, especially with some people in Congress. They really don't want change. They want some training programs, but they don't want any fundamental changes.
And so, Pamela, your generation is leading this, and the older generation, I hope, in what we're doing is being helpful. But how do you see us as being helpful? And importantly, I'd also like to know, what kinds of conversations are you having? And I don't mean to get super personal, but what kinds of conversations are you having with people of our Asian community who feel that, why are you doing this?
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think, young people have, like others have said, paved the way for many generations. And I mean, I myself feel like folks younger than me are more radical and thoughtful and intentional with the work that they're doing. So I'm learning from them just as much as I've learned from the folks whose backs I stand on in order to get to where I am. So I really want to acknowledge that. In terms of like conversations I've been having, I think for folks in my generation who've been in these progressive spaces and watching this widespread activation of young folks who previously just never cared about politics or stayed out of it, suddenly want to be engaged, those I think have been really productive conversations, sometimes hard, about how we think about justice and liberation from a place that is about coalition, not just for ourselves. So I think that's one of the challenging conversations that we as young people are having with each other. And then I think for the older generation, like I will preface, like my mother is a first generation immigrant and she does not speak English really well. Our mother tongue is Cantonese and I do not know how to say a lot of things in Cantonese. I'm at a kindergarten level. But what comes to mind when you ask this question is a conversation I had with her the other day where she asked me why I felt it was so necessary for me to be on the streets in the middle of a pandemic, right? Like I can't imagine her ever being on the streets. I don't want her to be, but I myself think it's worth the risk. So we had to have a very tough conversation, which I would argue was harder than any essay I've ever written in college during my ethnic studies degree. We had to have a really tough conversation about the significance of protests and the significance of, you know, Black liberation during this time for Asian Americans. And I did not know how to say it, but we did it. And she, I think, understood where I was coming from in the end. And I think, you know, a lot of young folks are trying to figure out how to have those conversations right now with their parents. And I think, I mean, in my family, a lot of my aunties who, you know, previously never really talked about this stuff are posting videos in Chinese about systemic racism. So I think it's a really interesting time. And I've seen, in addition to the young folks getting activated, a lot of older folks also starting to reflect about, you know, how all of these things are tied together with their own experiences, both in America and also back home.
And I would be remiss if I, who am the product of early multiracial coalition building, namely a Chinese grandfather and an African Jamaican grandmother, what we're seeing today in the, I would say, this generation seems to be less siloed racially than previous generations. One of the fastest growing demographics in the United States is mixed race, right? There seems to be a greater willingness to be friends and also quite possibly to fall in love. To that extent, how do we deal with the anti-Blackness that can sometimes rear its ugly head, particularly among immigrant communities? And I'm not going to limit it just to those of the Asian diaspora, but you know, I have been posting this, you know, so when people say Black Lives Matter, almost reflexively sometimes among the Asian and Asian American community, it's all lives matter. And what I've been posting is, and it certainly isn't original, but it's imagine that your child has died and you're giving the eulogy and you're talking about just how special your child is. And as you're talking about your child, someone comes up and takes the mic and says, all children are special. That's kind of like how it feels being part of the African diaspora and not having Black Lives Matter hang right there, because it is the most targeted, most denigrated. You know, I being mixed, I will say on the Asian side, it's the model minority. And on the African side, it's the minority no one wants to be. So how do we reconcile this today within the Asian community to get some greater understanding that this is a time where, while it may be time to shine more of the emphasis on the community of the African diaspora, and with coalition building, everyone would come along?
Well, my son is doing solidarity work, and you know, he comes home and he like tells me all the problems, and I say, well, you know, political struggle, that's why they call it struggle. It's a struggle. And I think what's been happening is these multi-pronged kinds of approaches to dealing with anti-Blackness in our communities. And that's been going on, again, also for decades too. But more recently, and maybe Pamela knows more about this, but you know, young Asian Americans have, you know, they've translated letters about Black lives for their families into, you know, dozens of different languages. People have talked personally, people have had, I know after Trump was elected at UCLA in Asian American Studies, we had like these almost like therapy groups with our students who, you know, they were going to have to go home for Thanksgiving and talk to their families. How do they talk to their families? Because they knew that their families had these very kind of sometimes right-wing views about immigrants. You know, they should come in the right way, about, you know, African Americans, about racial justice. So there's so many, I mean, that's one thing we try to do in the series is really, and I'm sure Pat Quo is going to do in the curriculum, is really seeding that history of solidarity. Because as Toni Morrison said, you know, the master narrative was written not by us. So we have to rewrite that narrative and talk about not only conflict, which has been the reigning kind of predominant narrative, but talk about solidarity and those instances of solidarity that Stewart was detailing in his talk.
Rachel, you're going to share with us some questions from the audience.
Yeah, I had somebody with their hand raised, but it looks like they put it down. And I don't see any questions coming through the chat box. However, if you would like to ask a question.
She just raised her hand again.
Just raised her hand.
Raised her hand again, yep.
Aaron.
Aaron, was it Aaron Chu?
Yes, just give me a minute. So thank you for this insightful presentation. My question is, do you find that the challenges of Asian American advocacy is the same or different from, I guess, that 70s, 80s period to now? And then the second part is, do you feel solidarity among people of color in America, so Asians, Blacks, Latinos, etc., is more fragmented now than it was back then? And why do you think that is?
You know, I just will start by saying, I don't think Americans really understand our collective histories. So, you know, the Chinese immigrants or the Asian immigrants, why would we expect them to know about US history? They came over after 1970. There weren't ethnic studies. They weren't told about the history of Blacks. They weren't even told about the history of Asian Americans. Most Asian Americans don't know about Vincent Chin. I think this is an opportunity for us to talk about some of the history. Vincent Chin, on the federal hate crimes case, he was the first Asian American to be protected by the federal hate crimes law, which was passed because Blacks were lynched for hundreds of years and nobody was ever convicted for killing Black people. You know, in 1965, Asian Americans saw the biggest change in immigration laws for the positive. People don't know that was because of the civil rights movement that was passed. So we have to talk about that history and why we're here today. But if people don't know about the history, they don't appreciate what people have gone through. I think we have to have tough discussions too. We have a number of Korean American staff. Some of their parents still have hard feelings towards the Black community from 1992. A number of Asians don't favor affirmative action. We should have that discussion because this is the time to have those hard discussions. And I'm not saying everybody's necessarily going to agree, but if you know the common history, if you know why we're even here, it puts a different shape to the discussion. And so I think this is the time. This is the time. I would just challenge the audience to think about what is the main Black group that you're working with. It could be a grassroots group, the Black Liberation, Black BLM, or it could be institutional groups like the Urban League or other groups. But we need to be very strategic. Who are you working with? Otherwise, it's going to fade away and people are going to lose the opportunity.
I think I'd start even a bit more basic. I agree completely with Stuart, but I would suggest that it starts on another level too, and that's being friends and even neighbors. I was going back to the point of how I came to be. And how I came to be was really because two people fell in love. And it seems as though for me, who, you know, in a couple of years I'll be 70, but it seems as though when I was a teen and in my early 20s and organizing and being a revolutionary, that we were more siloed. I was in New York. I was born and raised in Harlem. My parents came from Jamaica and my grandfather came from China. What I see now is that there's a greater recognition among the millennials and even Gen Z, where they don't see themselves as so stuck in their own communities. You know, we eat a certain food, we dance a certain way, we play certain games. I think that there's a greater globalization among that age group that I think is probably why we are seeing a global response to the murder of George Floyd, because across the world, people have their own instances of such horrific crimes. I used to be vice president of the Los Angeles Police Commission. I created a lot of hell, which is why I wasn't offered a second term. But what I'll say to you is that I never would have imagined that in my lifetime, there would be an actual call to rethink the police department, to think about how we're using armed officers to respond to such things as domestic arguments or a person having a mental breakdown or something along those lines. To me, it seems as though virtually anything is possible when we start looking at the already existing institutions and how can we remake them? How can we remake them across a broad coalition? Thank you, Erin.
Thank you.
We have about 1 minute left. It looks like there's a hand raised by Gay. Did you want to say your question?
Yes. It's not a question, but it's a comment. I know that my sister Paula was helping me through some gut-wrenching experiences over the weekend in having to answer my friends on social media exactly in terms of what do you do when your friends are throwing back all lives matter, or this Black person or this Hispanic person attacks somebody, and what do you do? And I think I was able to pull out of it finally when I go back to my teacher roots. I've been a teacher for about 50 years, and I think it's that little step that we can do, that we ourselves can do to fight racism when we encounter it. If we don't say anything, then we're going along with it. And it could be just as simple as so many of my friends are still calling Black people, my Chinese friends are still calling Black people Hakgui or Hakyan, right? And in a way, it's almost like the N-word in Chinese. That's what our parents and grandparents used to call Black people. It's really Black ghost, a literal translation. And so what I've now learned to do is just very gently do oh, you mean Black people, right? And so just little changes like that, you can't awaken everybody all at once, and you can't change the world all at once. But I think we each have a responsibility to do something. And that something could be as simple as changing how we call somebody, because what you call somebody is part of their identity. And so I want to send us off on a note where we're all empowered to do something. And I hope we take that empowerment and do something with it.
Thank you. Rachel, are we taking any more questions or are we winding up?
We have one more question if you guys would like to stay on for another minute.
Sure.
Kelly L., would you like to ask your question?
Yes. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. Great. Gay, that was amazing. I don't think this question, I actually think we should end on that, but at the same time, I selfishly want to ask my question. So, but yes, I was just wondering, you know, during, it's a two-handler, and if you can answer both, great. But I was desperate to learn about my history in a sense. And as I watched the documentary, Renee, your documentary, and just read up on everything, there were definitely moments I just felt like I wanted to connect more with. And one thing in particular was when you guys were fighting for Vincent's justice, was there ever a moment that you guys felt like was the turning point? Like the moment where you just felt like, okay, this is it. We can really, you know, move forward in one direction or another. And, you know, for myself, when I watched the doc, I always just felt like it was when Lily was on the Phil Donahue show, but I just didn't know. And it's one of those things where I just wanted to dive deeper in and try to figure it out myself. And then the second thing was, if you have time, another thing that I was just always curious about was, you know, Vicky and Vincent's fiance, where she stood as the protests, things were happening as far as moving towards justice for Vincent. Thank you.
Well, Vicky was very young. I think she just wanted to move on with her life. She didn't want to be interviewed, for example. But I don't think there was to me, and Stuart might have a different opinion, I don't think there was a turning point. I think in these kinds of movements, it's, you know, it's protracted, and there are different kind of entry points. There are people coming from the legal perspective, from organizing and activism. People from the arts were contributing. And so these are, and even within the bigger picture, I think that people often think that the Vincent Chin case started something, but the Vincent Chin case rested upon the legacy of what had been built. It was like these constant building blocks. So I have the same feeling about what's going on today, like with the George Floyd case. I mean, there is spontaneity, but it also is part of these building blocks of, you know, solidarity and, you know, the idea of defund the police. I mean, people have been thinking about that and developing policy around that for many, many years. So, you know, it's like the analogy of the Rosa Parks. People think that Rosa Parks just got on the bus one day because she was tired, but actually she was a longtime activist. There are a number of people who were designated as being possible Rosa Parks, and it was an act of civil disobedience that was very intentional. And so I think that in the Vincent Chin case, you know, it's just, as I said, there were, you know, people who came out of the Asian American movement. There were people who were like the lawyers and, you know, artists, filmmakers, and they all kind of came together and everything got bigger, but there was this infrastructure that already existed.
Yes, I would just add that there were different developments in the case. So in the first federal trial, when there was a conviction, that was a positive sign. But I think the big breakthrough happened afterwards. We were so inspired by Mrs. Chin. And I think there were hundreds of organizations that were started. I know I was inspired to build the strongest Asian American civil rights organization that we could possibly have. And, you know, it was just so inspirational that she fought for justice for her son. And we didn't want other mothers to go through what she had gone through. And so we just pledged ourselves to do the best we could to build that movement. And so I think that there was an outcome that actually happened after the case, and that, you know, hundreds of people, probably thousands of people got mobilized, joined the movement, started nonprofit organizations, made them stronger, reached out to other ethnic groups. I think that to me was the inspiration.
Pamela, do you have a closing comment you'd like to make?
Yeah, I mean, I think the questions talked about a time that I wasn't alive, but I think, like, you know, as Asian America continues to grow, not just in like idea, but also in its political activity, it's important to connect with grassroots organizations that are doing some really great work on the ground. In particular, I've been involved with CCAD Los Angeles, Seeding Change, and also Asians for Black Lives, which is a collective of Asian folks who show up for Black lives whenever there are actions. So I encourage folks, in addition to different nonprofits that do some amazing service work and act as amazing, you know, legacy organizations, to also engage with really, really grassroots organizations that are only run by volunteers as well.
Well, I would like very much to thank our panelists. I'd like to thank Renee and Stuart and Pamela. This for me was quite enlightening, and I enjoyed it. I think at one point we had almost 300 people participating, and even though we've gone over time, there's now 235 people still on. So I'd say that this was a very successful discussion. Thank you to our president, Gay. Thank you to our executive director, Michael. Thank you to our staff and our board. And the next event that's coming up that we hope you all will join us for is the Arthur Dong Book Talk, Hollywood Chinese. It'll be July 1 at 5 p.m. Pacific time. For more information, please go to our website, camla.com. And we are very grateful to you. I would just implore everyone here. I noted that Pamela said she learned about Vincent Chin during her Asian Studies program. It's time that we talk to our children. It's time that we talk to our grandchildren and have them know the true history, the contributions, the legacy, even the discriminations against the Asian American community here in the United States, because only with that education will we be able to affect permanent and lasting change. So thank you, everyone. Good night. And we will be posting this later on our website, and hope to see you again on July 1. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.